Okay, time for a pop quiz. See how long it takes you to guess what I am reading. On the basis of what has been agreed, I said, there is a need for the best men to have intercourse as often as possible with the best women, and the reverse for the most ordinary men with the most ordinary women. And the offspring of the former must be reared, but not that of the others, if the flock is going to be of the most eminent quality. All right, if you guessed Plato, you were right. We are starting here on book 5 of Plato's Republic. And boy, oh boy, this is like Plato, come get your boy Socrates. He drunk. It really starts to go into dark territory here. And this is some of the stuff that has most troubled people for more than 2,000 years about this text. If you're new joining us here for the first time, first of all, welcome. Second of all, we are going through Plato's Republic book by book. I often do episodes just on one work, but this one, it's such a foundational text for the history of Western political philosophy, Western thought generally, that I want you to know what's in it. I want you to go through book by book. This is the classical education that you did not know you were missing, and this is one that I, think it's worth representing exactly how the argument proceeds, because part of what I've been arguing, there's this long-standing debate and discussion about how serious is this book. It's a book about the perfect state, the Kallipolis, right? The ideal government. The idea is what's true justice, what's perfect justice in a state, in a city, and then therefore what's true justice in a man, right? The sort of macrocosm and microcosm version of justice. And throughout, I have been saying it's probably impossible for us to tell exactly where the irony takes over and where the Plato is really endorsing some of these programs. But I think the main point is not whether, Plato wants us to all to live in a city that looks like the Callipolis, but the point is that Socrates has understood the assignment. He has an assignment, and that is to think through in pure rational terms, coldly rational terms, what the most just city would look like, what the ideal, you might say, indeed, Platonic form of justice is, and how it manifests. And basically, it's about order, right? It's about order and control. And so one of the things that Plato does masterfully is he forces you to confront what it would be like to think your way ruthlessly through the ideal city. If justice and order were your highest goods and you were just abstracting, what you would do if you didn't care about dispossessing people, if you didn't care about lying to people, moving from their homes, right? Or rather, if you only cared about those things insofar as you could make an argument for their justice and no other concerns, right? No concerns about personal attachments or devotion or whatever. What would that city look like? And one of the things he shows us is it veers off into some really dark stuff like the eugenics passage that I read at the beginning, because that's what it is. It's a passage about culling the herd, right? And lying to people about it. You just, the guardians and the people in control will set up a situation in which the best people mate with each other and produce, good genetic stock. And then the worst people either aren't allowed to mate or their children are exposed. And that's just a real thing that happens, in Sparta, for example. I've been talking about the fact that Spartans practice this form of eugenics, exposing the weak infants or the unwanted infants. And it's really only our kind of centuries of Christian teaching that have and Jewish teaching that have instilled in us this idea that this is just a blasphemy and an evil and an abomination to kill children, right? And when you strip that away and when you kind of try to divorce yourself from the traditions of your heart and the things that you love, right? The traditions of your society and the attachments of your heart, you end up veering into this kind of hyper rationalist age and into this hyper rationalist mode where you can argue for anything. So that's what I'm going to be talking about. We're going to be taking a direct look. How does Plato, through Socrates, get to that passage I read at the beginning, and how does the whole thing work? It's structured in 3 different waves, right? Because the whole book 5 is about the community of wives and children among the guardians. This is the elite, the highest class, the upper crust of the Callipolis, and Socrates has said that they're all going to share their wives in common. There's not going to be any family. There's just going to be this kind of communist thing. We had the send up version of that a couple of weeks ago in Aristophanes, the assembly women. Now we have the serious case for it, and there are 3 waves of argument about why you should do that or why you should or should not do that and whether or not it's possible. Because there's this whole argument that thing in Jurassic Park, right? Your scientists spend so much time discussing whether they could do something. They never stop to consider whether they should. So that's something that comes up here is like, should we do this? Should there be a Callipolis? And can there be a Callipolis? And those two things are kind of part of these three waves. I'm going to talk in a second about what those three waves are. We have a new sponsor. These guys are really cool. They're called Bambee, Bambee, and they are an automated HR service, which is really cool because I don't know if you're a small business owner, if you work at a small business, wherever you are, whatever you're doing, you need to be able to cover your HR concerns. I mean, you can get like one complaint against your company and turn the entire world upside down, right? I've heard horror stories from friends who like, some ridiculous claim about like sexual harassment that never happened. And like they're suddenly entangled in litigation. It's unbelievable stuff. Bambee is here to help. They help small business owners to implement good HR practices. They are a platform built for businesses just like yours. So you can automate the most important HR practices. And this is cool too. You get a real person, your own dedicated HR manager. An in-house HR manager can cost up to $80,000 a year. With Bambee, it costs starting at $99 a month. No hidden fees, cancel anytime, and they've got a great deal for Young Heretics listeners. Bambee.com/heretics. I know y'all are out there building the Young Heretics empire, becoming fabulously wealthy, starting your small businesses. And seriously, I know you are doing that. So go to Bambee.com/heretics and get your HR sorted. So remember that in the Guardian class, in the elite of this imaginary Callipolis, the perfect city, the women are going to do everything alongside the men. They're going to do, training for war. They're going to get naked and do gymnastics together. And Socrates is sort of saying, well, can we do this given that we think women are kind of, physically weaker and worse than everything else? And here's his argument for why women, even though they maybe have these disadvantages, are nevertheless meant to be side by side with the men in the upper classes. So right away, he gets into these animal metaphors, which is kind of part of how he leads us into the eugenics. Right? Do we believe the females of the guardian dogs must guard the things the males guard along with them and hunt with them? He's saying if you keep dogs, right? If you have pet dogs or if you have dogs for hunting, don't the females and the males do the same thing together and do the rest in common? Or must they stay indoors, the females, as though they were incapacitated as a result of bearing and rearing the puppies, while the males work and have all the care of the flock? Everything in common, says Glaucon, except that we use the females as weaker and the males as stronger. Is it possible, said Socrates, I said, to use any animal for the same things if you don't assign it the same rearing and education? No, it's not possible. If then we use the women for the same things as the men, they must also be taught the same things. And so this is the first principle, essentially, is that they're going to be doing the same stuff. Women and men are both going to be guarding the city, both going to be martial, both going to, have this philosophical training, this musical training. And so are we comfortable putting them in the same training together? Well, they surely must be able to to do the same things, even though, of course, women physically weaker, right? Nevertheless, sort of a realist about that, but nevertheless, we're going to put them together because, and this is an important part of the argument too, although men and women have different natures, the nature of a thing is only relevant to the task that you're talking about. So if, for example, you talk about actually, let's get into his argument for how this works. Do you distinguish between the man who has a good nature for a thing and another who has no nature for it on these grounds? The one learns something connected with that thing easily, the other with difficulty. The one, starting from slight learning, is able to carry discovery far forward in the field he has learned, while the other, having chanced on a lot of learning and practice, can't even preserve what he learned. And the bodily things give adequate service to the thought of the man with the good nature while they oppose the thought of the other man. Are there any other things than these by which you distinguish the man who has a good nature for each discipline from the one who hasn't? No one, he says, will assert that there are others. Do you know of anything that is practiced by human beings in which the class of men doesn't excel that of women in all these respects? Or shall we draw it out at length by speaking of weaving and the care of baked and boiled dishes, just as those activities in which the reputation of the female sex is based and where its defeat is most ridiculous of all? And Glaucon says, as you say, it's true that the one class is quite dominated in virtually everything, so to speak, by the other. However, many women are better than many men in many things. But as a whole, it is as you say. Therefore, my friend, there is no practice of a city's governors which belongs to woman because she's woman, or to man because he's man, but the natures are scattered alike among both animals. And woman participates along, according to the nature, in all practices, and man in all. But in all of them, woman is weaker than man. So today, the way we would describe this is they're talking about the distinction between the population level and the individual, right? They're basically saying they're unblushing misogynist in one way. They said, women are basically worse than men at everything. This is not a Christine de Paysanne. This is not kind of what I've been suggesting as the real vision of the world, in which men and women are kind of have two sides of the world to present, and each have their strengths and their weaknesses, right? This is like men are better at everything, and this is also, by the way, a feature of this kind of hyper rationalist, kind of pure intellectualism for which Plato has been known and maligned throughout history. Is that if the sort of fleshly material world is just a weakness and a distraction, and if it just drags you down out of the pure world of the forms, then of course, like the kind of cold, manly rationalist attitude is going to make you think that in general women are just worse than men, right? And so this is kind of explains why Plato sees the world in this way. I said before that Christianity is one of the things that actually grounds us back in the weakness and softness and the emotional realities of the world. And without that, Plato is basically just pushing forward into this hyper masculinist idea. But he says there are some women who are better than some men at everything. Basically, you can find any task, any skill, even though in the aggregate at the population level, women are going to fail and men are going to excel. Nevertheless, there are some women who are really good at stuff, and therefore it's not qua women. It's not as women or as men that they should be excluded or included, but rather in their nature as guardians, right? So this is the idea that you can have a different nature for different kinds of things, right? I have a nature as a man. I have a nature as a podcaster. I have a nature as a writer, right? And those things, I'm not good at, say, writing because I am a man, right? I'm good at writing because I'm a writer, and this is a distinction that will run through the rest of Greek philosophy. So at the same time as he's kind of, driving into this really kind of myopic vision, this sort of single-minded idea, he's also giving us the foundation for a lot of the ways that we now think, right? That you can have a population that in the aggregate is a certain way. But of course, that says nothing about any individual within that group. It's something that we are now totally failing to recognize on both the right and the left, right? We're having all these arguments about like, well, black people and white people do this and that, right? And usually we then leave out the fact that like whatever aggregate measure you can take of the, a population as a whole, of women tend to vote this way, or, black people tend to have this level IQ, or whatever it is that you're arguing about, it's like, that doesn't actually tell you anything about the person that's sitting there in front of you, who is a unique human soul, and in his nature as a human, right, actually has potential and abilities beyond what you may have decided about his sort of aggregate set or whatever. So insofar as he's having this argument, right, we were inclined to agree with him. But listen now to what comes next. And understand how this kind of shades us over into some of the hyper-rationalism that I've been accusing him of. Now, I know that I have a lot of successful business managers out there. You guys need to check out Indeed. If you're going to build the Young Heretics empire and become fabulously wealthy, you need Indeed because they are the one-stop shop hiring partner where you can attract, interview, and hire all in one place. If you are, anybody who's successful in business is there because they love it, right? They're doing the research, they're doing the work, they're setting stuff up, making deals. But not everybody has time to be investigating all these different possible resumes. Where do you look for them? All that stuff. It's like not really your job. Indeed takes care of all that for you. Instead of spending hours on multiple job sites hoping to find candidates, you need one powerful hiring partner that can help you do it all. We use Indeed here at Soundfront to find excellent talent for the podcasts. Not me, of course. I just wandered in off the street, but the people that make me look good. We use Indeed to find them. It's a great service. You can start hiring now with a $75 sponsored job credit to upgrade your job post. Go to Indeed.com/heretics to claim your $75 credit. One more time, that's Indeed.com/heretics. Terms and conditions apply. If you need to hire, you need Indeed. So en route to talking about sort of blending the education of men and women and basically holding all things with them in common, right? The gymnastics, the war, all the training and music and so on. He says this about having to get over your sort of irrational prejudices. And this is very much akin to some of what we talk about today in I think a really misguided way. So it's sort of interesting. Um, they say music and gymnastics were given to the men in education. He says yes. Then these two arts and what has to do with war must be assigned to the women also, because we're deciding, right, to put men and women together, and they must be used in the same ways. On the basis of what you say, says Glaucon, it's likely. Perhaps, I said, compared to what is habitual, many of the things now being said would look ridiculous if they were to be done as is said. So he's saying, this is, if we're going to make this change, it's going to look absurd to us, right? Indeed, they would. What's the most ridiculous thing you see among them? I said. Or is it plain that it's the women exercising naked with the men in the palaestras, not only the young ones, but even the older ones too, like the old men in the gymnasiums, who, when they are wrinkled and not pleasant to the eye, all the same, love gymnastics? By Zeus, he said, that would look ridiculous in the present state of things. Well, I said, since we've started to speak, we mustn't be afraid of all the jokes of whatever kind the wits might make if such a change took place in gymnastic, in music, and not the least in the bearing of arms and the riding of horses. What you say is right, he said. But since we've begun to speak, we must make our way to the rough part of the law, begging these men not to mind their own business, but to be serious, and reminding them that it is not so long ago that it seemed shameful and ridiculous to the Greeks, as it does now to the many among the barbarians, to see men naked. And that is what the Cretans, when the Cretans originated the gymnasiums and then the Lacedaemonians, it was possible for the urbane of the time to make a comedy of all that. Now, it's interesting that he phrases this in terms of comedy because, of course, one of the things that comedy often mocks is the eggheads and the philosophers, right? We saw this in the clouds. And so Plato is basically defending himself against the charge that, well, this is absurd. This is ridiculous, right? And he's saying, no, your gag reflex, your impulse to call things disgusting is highly conditioned and arbitrary. And it just has to do with what you're used to. You're used to seeing men naked, so you don't laugh at that. But you're not used to seeing women naked together with men. And so you do laugh at that, but eventually you'll get over that too. This is an idea of conditioning, right? And we talk this way all the time now, as if disgust and fear and sort of just a general reaction against something is basically just all of that is just a prejudice, right? And you point to an example of a time when that was true, right? Well, in the past, people would have been disgusted, at a black man and a white woman getting married, and now we know that that's not wrong at all, and so we have to get over our disgust at everything. And of course, the problem with this is that it's actually not reasonable because it suggests that everything is the same kind of thing, right? All disgust is just negative prejudice because some disgust is based on negative prejudice, right? You say this kind of thing that you had this particular prejudice and that was wrong. So why not get rid of all your prejudices and just do what seems right in the abstract, right? Like I said, Socrates understood the assignment. He is building the abstract perfect city without any intervention from any kind of history or previous feelings or set of aesthetic principles that comes from any background culture. He's just sweeping all of that away. And the problem with this, of course, is that ultimately some of your disgust and some of your horror is telling you something true, right? And so when we look at something like, say, the metaverse or transhumanism, right? When we talk about these brave new adventures that our technologists are currently suggesting that we go on, it's always our first reaction is like, oh, that looks awful, right? That looks like, kind of dystopian and horrific to just be sitting slumped with your virtual reality glasses on and uploading yourself into the cloud, right? That we have all these stories about that make us feel as if it's wrong. And the rationalist argument is often, well, just get over it, right? Just, that's just you have no rational basis. You can't explain that. Now, what's the solution here? Because it is true that sometimes our prejudices are just instinctive reactions need to be gotten over and they're not right. But of course, the reality is, right, that when you have that kind of first response, like, oh, I think it would be ridiculous for men and women to exercise naked together, you should ask yourself, like, what's that telling me? What information is that giving me? Is it just telling me that it's not something I particularly want to do? Or is it telling me that there's actually something inherently shameful in men and women? Because men and women do have different natures in this respect, right? That their naked bodies carry certain sexual charge, right? And all these things. And so Plato is basically showing Socrates, like, sweeping all of that away And, whereas I think that that's probably an impulse that Plato himself was probably keen or prone to, right, and vulnerable to. It's also not necessarily just exactly what Plato wants us to do, so much as it is he's saying, if you're going to build a perfect city in the utopian clouds, just like many of our modern technologists want to do, you're going to have to do this. You're going to have to sweep away all of your instinctive and gut feelings about stuff. And are you ready to? Are you prepared to? My very firm instinct is that we should not do this, and that usually when somebody comes along and says to us, "Well, you feel like this is gross and disgusting," but that's just your old prejudice. Usually, if they only have that argument, if it's just a kind of anti-prejudice prejudice, a prejudice against prejudices, then they're trying to sell you something disastrous. So, especially today, I feel very suspicious of this, and I think we all should. When somebody comes along and says, "Well, your reason is really the only thing," you just trust your reason and ignore all of your gut instincts, because your brain's imperfect too, and your gut also has things to tell you. So this is kind of why the second wave, which we're about to get into, becomes so horrifying, right? I said I was going to lead you into the eugenics. And this is a really important part of it. The idea that, like, well, if you can make an argument, a kind of rational A plus B equals C argument for it, then the fact that you find this horrifying doesn't really matter at all. And of course, it does matter. It's telling you something. It's part of your connection to the moral universe, is your instinctual reaction to things. Let's hear now the second wave. So that's the first wave, right? Men and women have all the same education together, because they can be, even though they're in the aggregate, they're different. They have these, the ability to be the same. And so we can bring them together individually as in one, and get over our kind of atavistic reactions to it that just, come from prejudice. Now, wave two is, as Socrates says, this is a bigger wave too. This sort of like waves as in of the ocean, right, coming to drown you. This is a really a bigger one, and that's, should men and women have all of their sexual relationships in common, and how does this work? So I'm going to read to you now this sort of argument from the analogy to animals, again, about why men and women should just have all sorts of sex with all these different people, as long as it produces the best possible society. So we're going back here to you've got hunting dogs. I see hunting dogs and quite a throng of noble cocks in your house. Did you, in the name of Zeus, ever notice something about their marriages and procreation? What? He said. First, although they are all noble, aren't there some among them who are and prove to be best? There are. Do you breed from all alike, or are you eager to breed from the best as much as possible? From the best. And what about this? From the youngest or from the oldest, or as much as possible from those in their prime? From those in their prime. And if they weren't so bred, do you believe that the species of birds and that of dogs would be far worse for you? I do, he said. And what do you think about horses and other animals? Is it in any way different? That would be strange. Saying, we're just a kind of animal. We're a rational animal, right? So we should breed for the most rational animals. And on the basis, therefore, and here's the passage I read at the beginning, on the basis of what has been agreed, there is a need for the best men to have intercourse as often as possible with the best women, and the reverse for the most ordinary men with the most ordinary women. And the offspring of the former must be reared, but not that of the others, if the flock is going to be of the most eminent quality. And all this must come to pass without being noticed by anyone except the rulers themselves, if the guardian's herd is to be as free as possible from faction. Remember that we're avoiding that we're trying to avoid stasis, right? Perfect unity in the city, perfect order and unity is what we're going for, because Plato's idea is that justice has to do with the right ordering of things in their proper place. And I've endorsed this idea. I believe that this idea is true. But of course, right, I believe that if it's your only priority, right, if this is your sole priority, then you're going to make yourself a monster, just as if you elevate anything else as an idol, right? This is really a form of idolatry to say, well, reason and justice are our highest good, and so all other things must be sacrificed at the altar of reason and justice. Even if reason and justice are good things, you make them into idols and you turn people into animals, right? This is what's going on, is that we're sort of saying, well, you breed, and it's all couched in such wonderfully euphemistic language, really, and it sounds exactly like the eugenicist, right? It just says, like, of course, in order to have the best quality livestock, you need to cull certain individuals, and really, we just can't tell people about this, of course, because they reject. But this is really obviously the way forward, and it will make everybody, peaceable, because they won't be fighting over who's better and who's worse, and they won't be fighting over their particular attachment to their wife and their child and so forth. And this is also why there's not going to be any, money held in private property among the guardians as well. And next comes the question, well, okay, so if that's one part of sex, right, is just making the best people, um, then perhaps the other thing is that sex has a kind of pleasurable part of it. And so the complete severing of these two things, right, the total severance of pleasure and procreation, right, is what leads to this next passage, which is as he goes on, he says basically you should be able to, um, if you're good, you should be allowed to have a lot of sex. He says, I suppose that when the women and the men are beyond the age of procreation, we will, of course, leave them free to have intercourse with whomsoever they wish, except with the daughter, a mother, the children of their daughters, and the ancestors of their mother. And as for the women, except with a son and a father, and the descendants of the one and the ancestors of the other. And all this only after they have been told to be especially careful, never to let even a single fetus see the light of day, if one should be conceived, and if one should force its way to deal with it on the understanding that there's to be no rearing for such a child. That's certainly a sensible statement, says Glaucon, but how will they distinguish one another's fathers and daughters and the others you just mentioned? Not at all, I said, but of all the children born in the 10th month and in the 7th, from the day a man becomes a bridegroom, he will call the males sons and the females daughters, and they will call him father. And in the same way, he will call their offspring grandchildren, and they in turn will call his group grandfathers and grandmothers. And those who were born at the same time as their mothers and fathers were procreating, they will call sisters and brothers. Now, I've already read to you repeatedly on this podcast Aristotle's objection to this from his Politics. Aristotle says basically, if you do this, you're making basically a life for slaves rather than rulers because you're diluting the attachment. If everybody considers everybody else's kids his own kids, right? Sort of takes a village, right? There's no such thing as other people's children. You've maybe heard people say that in connection to the Florida law that stops teachers from indoctrinating kids in like third grade about gay sex and LGBTQ stuff or whatever. This Florida law has created a reaction in which basically the idea is your children belong to everybody, and what that really means is your children belong to the state, right? Your children are going to be taught that they can be genderqueer and 50 different genders and whatever your objections are, right? And so the Aristotelian objection to this, besides that it's a nightmare scenario, is that your children are actually yours, and that intensifies your love for them. And we've seen this in the way that people have reacted to discovering what people like Terry McAuliffe and the alphabet crazies really want is to basically communize child rearing. And people respond to this with great horror because they love their children. And so this is essentially what Plato, that human impulse, that natural impulse, Socrates is essentially amputating that in this book. He's doing his best to condition you out of your attachments so that he can have his perfect state, right? And he's basically saying, if you want the perfect state, this is what you have to do, right? And so one thing that I at least learned from this, right? I mean, of course, as a magnificent, as a masterwork of Western philosophy, right? One of the things this does is it gives different things to different people. But one of the things it gives to me is my firm conviction that I don't want to live in the perfect state, right? Because I know that actually my personal attachments, my love, my desires that attach to individuals and that, connect me to them are a major part of what makes life worth living. And that's also sort of part of what Aristotle says in response to this. And when you cut that away, you maybe get something that is like orderly, but you also get something that no sane person should want to live in, because our attachments and our impulses and even some of our prejudices, even if they need correction, even if they need alteration, they nevertheless connect us to something true and fleshly and real about the world. And if you amputate it, you end up with something less than human. And this is why the next passage that I'm going to read to you is actually not from the Republic, but from Aldous Huxley's Brave New World, because some of you may already know that we're kind of going here as we talk about the way that Plato's managing child rearing here. But it's astonishing that Plato saw the implications of utopianism again 2,000 years before Aldous Huxley did. In 1932, he writes Brave New World, very famous dystopian novel, it kind of sending up this idea of perfectionism, and it was both a satire, weirdly, of kind of American excess and a satire of sort of Stalinist or Trotskyite utopianism. And one of the things that has made this book so enduring in our age is that it actually got something right that we maybe missed when we were thinking about, when we talk just about Stalinism and the excesses of communism. as this kind of like, gray, cold, dark block of, just purely ordered society with no spirit and no life. Of course, that's one manifestation of the sort of Stalinist utopian vision. But another one is actually very bright and colorful. And that's something that we're currently going through with this profusion, right? Of, oh, you have every kind of sex you could ever possibly want. And as long as it's equally pleasurable and as long as it's consensual, there's no distinction, right? And men can be women and women can be men, right? That's kind of really depicted in Brave New World because he sees that the utopianism can come to you with the kind of colors of physical pleasure, even as it sucks all of the life out of your real attachments. And so this is the famous passage from Brave New World in which he describes what's called Bokanovsky's process and their methods for gestating embryos outside of the womb, and until they become the different classes of people that operate in their society. And so here's the sort of teacher of a bunch of students explaining to people, to the students, how the kids are created. Because the predestinators send their figures to the fertilizers, who give them the embryos they ask for, and the bottles come in here to be predestined in detail, after which they are sent down to the embryo store, where we now proceed ourselves. And opening a door, Mr. Foster led the way down a staircase into the basement. The temperature was still tropical. They descended into a thickening twilight. 2 doors and a passage with a double turn ensured the cellar against any possible infiltration of the day. Embryos are like photograph film, said Mr. Foster waggishly as he pushed open the second door. They can only stand red light. And in effect, the sultry darkness into which the students now followed him was visible and crimson, like the darkness of closed eyes on a summer's afternoon. The bulging flanks of row on receding row and tier above tier of bottles glinted with immeasurable rubies, and among the rubies moved the dim red specters of men and women with purple eyes and all the symptoms of lupus. The hum and rattle of machinery faintly stirred the air. Give them a few figures, Mr. Foster, said the director, who was tired of talking. Mr. Foster was only happy to give them a few figures. He goes on, he describes the dimensions of this gallery, all of the different embryos that are being like cooked up there, and the process, the Bokanovsky process, whereby they kind of clone embryos, followed by the predestination and class orientation process, whereby they do things like they inject, alcohol infusion into certain embryos to make them dumber, and they stunt their growth, also that they can have this, society of different classes of people, much like in Plato's Republic. Obviously he didn't envisage this kind of technology, but this kind of culling of the herd, right, which comes in hyper scientific language in Brave New World, is exactly based on the same principles of this book 5 of the Republic, which is, well, there are some things that are better than others, some people that are better than others, and we need certain people to fill certain roles. So of course, why shouldn't we, if that's all that matters, and if our horror at the notion of, taking artificial wombs and basically creating the sort of physical, the human capital that we need by manipulating genetic growth and all of that, if that doesn't horrify you, then why not just go ahead and do it, right? It's only the conditioning that we have by the long centuries of imago Dei thought, the thought that all people are created in the image of God, that we are more than just fleshly objects to be manipulated at will. Only that conditioning leads us to feel horror at this idea, right? And it's not a purely rational thing. Of course, our reason can be marshaled to defend it, but in doing so, our reason is essentially describing something that we know intuitively in our hearts. And if you condition that out of people utterly, then they have no North Star, because you can reason your way into anything, right? This is the sort of deep secret at the heart of all of this, is if you just choose what to value, if you choose that, your order and stability is going to be your highest good, then you can reason your way into anything. You can use that to justify any atrocity, any horror, as we are currently seeing, right? As we saw in the Gulag Archipelago, as we see now, if it's diversity, right? If diversity is our strength, then of course you can, you need to inject children with hormones to block their puberty. You need to. It's a matter of urgent importance that you do this because we're all now sacrificing to a new idol, right? The idol of transhumanism, the idol of perfect liberation from the body, and you have to kill off all of your instincts. That's why they get at children, right? That's why it's not because like you need some sort of like it's not because there's some inherent link between like homosexuality and pedophilia. Like that's not what's going on here. What's going on is that there is an intensely anti-nature ideology that has to do with the total breakdown of the boundary of the human person. And in order to create that, you have to get at kids as young as possible, right? That's why they're reaching out into like Tumblr blogs and public schools, right? And that's why there's so much angst at the idea that they might not be able in Florida, for example, to teach kids about all these different kinds of sex at a very young age, right? It's because in order to rewire somebody's brain to resist the natural truths that we're male and female and these things have consequences for us and are good and natural and healthy, right? In order to rewire somebody's brain so that they don't think those things, you have to get them very, very young and scrape away all of the human impulses that we have, which is exactly what Plato is doing, because he knows that if you want a perfectly ordered society, if you want to take total control over a state, you're going to have to do that. And the fact that we feel horror at it tells us something very important. We shouldn't silence that voice, which tells us, gosh, this looks like dystopia. Because that's the thing. That's why we tell dystopian stories at all, right? It's because our instincts about the stories tell us something that our reason maybe can't necessarily. Your reason needs values to be working with, right? And ultimately, your values are going to be given to you not by reasoning your way to them, although you may reason about them and examine them in the light of reason. But the things that you know to be good, right? Things like love, and things that you know to be bad, things like murder, right? Don't come to you because you're able to make a perfect syllogistic argument for them. Come to you because you are a moral agent created by God to know the good. And if you scrap all the gut feelings and gut instincts that you have and just decide that prima facie, because they are gut impulses, they are wrong, you're going to end up a brain in a jar and it's going to turn you into a monster. Let's get back to Plato and let's talk now about how this book proceeds, because the next part is going to kind of lead us into book 6 for next time. I swear, every time these days I'm reading a piece and I think, wow, this is well written. And if it's not by me or at one of the publications I work for, it's often, almost always, I would say, at The Spectator. They publish such good stuff. They have authors I love, Douglas Murray, Christopher Caldwell, just a nice range, Christopher Buckley, Julie Bindel, just a range of folks, different, ideological bents, but all kind of, free of identity politics, dogma, or any form of just this sort of dumb online firefighting that we do. They eschew identity politics in favor of intelligent conversation and thought. They are also the longest running magazine in the world. So they must be doing something right. And their US edition has just newly come ashore. It's bringing that same high quality writing and analysis to US audiences. The Spectator also covers the best in books, travel, food, wine, really a lot of good stuff in there. And they have a special offer for listeners of Young Heretics, which is always excellent. And this is a great one because it includes a free hat. If you sign up today, you'll get 3 free months of the print magazine and full digital access. That's really good. Plus, they will give you a free Spectator hat when you go to spectatorworld.com/special offer and use the offer code Heretics, Heretics. One more time, it's spectatorworld.com/special offer. Then you have to use the offer code Heretics to get 3 free months, full digital access, and a free Spectator hat. Go check it out. So where we left off, we had sex is, you can do it as long as you don't have babies with you can have sex with anybody you want as long as you don't have babies. And then in order to have the best possible babies when you are of procreative age, you need to, be encouraged to and rewarded with sex with the best people for being excellent, and sort of discouraged or stopped if you're sort of subpar, if you're a homunculus or whatever. And babies that don't fit this model need to be exposed or, not reared, as it's sort of delicately said. And this leads us then into a kind of interlude about war, because remember, the whole thing is for order, right? It's for sort of stable societies that don't erupt into stasis, into civil war. And so we have this kind of interlude about, what are going to be the rules of just war in this society? Well, you can't enslave fellow Greeks. You can't fight among these Greek cities. Essentially, what he's establishing here is the friend-enemy distinction, which is a very old principle of politics, and one that, again, kind of, is lost in many of our current discussions, but especially now when, like, we basically have decided, or our elites have decided, that America is bad, right? But the friend-enemy distinction is always operative, right? Who are the people that you're trying to help? Who are the people that you're trying to hurt? And Plato is trying to establish here that there's no stasis, there's no internecine warfare allowed between Greeks, because Greeks are friends, right? And we're trying to be as stable as possible. So here I'll just read a little bit of this, and then we'll move on to the third wave. He says, as Greeks, they won't ravage Greece or burn houses, nor will they agree that in any city all are their enemies, men, women, and children, but that there are always a few enemies who are to blame for the differences. And on all these grounds, they won't be willing to ravage lands or tear down houses, since the many are friendly, and they'll keep up the quarrel until those to blame are compelled to pay the penalty, and the blameless ones who are suffering. And remember that this is very raw for Plato, and any Greek-speaking reader of Plato, or occupant of the Greek world, because not too long ago we've come out of the Peloponnesian War, which was defined essentially by infighting among Greek-speaking states, especially Sparta and Athens, but also their allies, and then even internally within kind of Greek Empire, there was this, they were riven with faction, and they essentially did split up into these rival camps. And this is one of the things that Plato is very keen to avoid, and it's understandable why, right? That he wants to effectively find a system to make sure that that never happens again. And he's kind of constructing this idea that the Greeks are friends, right? Those who speak Greek, which has not always been true. In fact, it's almost never been true, right? Because you have the Greeks that Medized back in the Persian Wars that went with Persia. You've had the long-standing back and forth between Athens and Sparta, followed by the Peloponnesian War. He's essentially trying to say, like, if you want to create peace, you have to get rid of all of that, because the true city, the really just city, we've talked about this before, is one, right? It's one city. You don't have infighting, you don't have factions. Where a lot of this has all come from, right? Getting rid of money, getting rid of marriage, personal marriage, right? Is all to try to eliminate the sources of tension. And this is something, again, that we do all the time. We see that excesses can occur, and then we infer from this that the way to have perpetual peace is to just cut off the thing that caused the excess. So let me give you an example. 20th century, defined in part by the excesses and the disastrous just failings, really, full stop, of communism, and of Marxism as an ideology, and of utopianism and socialism, right? But defined also, let's be fair, right, by the hyper nationalism of the Nazis, of the fascists, right? And this kind of commitment, the making of the nation into an idol, right? The state is your idol, and the state is the highest good. And in service of the state, we do anything. We kill, eradicate whole populations, and what you end up with there is 6 million dead Jews, right? And so the utter horror of that, right, of making nationalism and the state and the nation not only into a good, but the highest, the only good, right? That has caused us to think that nationalism is bad, right? That patriotism and jingoism are the same thing. Why? Because we saw how terribly wrong everything went, right? How hideous and how nightmarish the satanic disasters that came out of Nazism. And we said, well, we better never just flirt with too much nationalism again. We better just, try to tamp down all of those impulses in ourselves. And of course, the problem with this is that because we live in a broken world, and because the thoughts of man's mind are evil continually, right? All good things are subject to that kind of inflation beyond the pale, right? All good things can veer out of control. And when you do never again this way, when you say, like, the way that we're going to get out of this is we're just going to look, the bad guy came from over there, so we're just going to spend our whole time looking that direction and never letting anybody even come close to us from that direction. Of course, somebody's going to come up from you to you from behind, right? And this is what this is like. If you get rid of all nationalism to avoid the horrors of nationalism, what you end up with is the horrors of globalism, and that's currently what we are living through. So I digress slightly, but I think it's kind of interesting to observe this at work in Plato as well, that he had lived through this period of intense factionalism, and was living with the aftermath of it, essentially, and sort of wanted to just nip that in the bud forever. And that leads him to these excesses, right? The excesses, if you're not going to have any factionalism, then you're never going to have any possessions, you're going to have any property. And that is also going to collapse you into a kind of a deadened sort of state. So it's its own version, really, of our thing, where now we're going to be globalists. There's going to be no nations. For Plato, it's like there are going to be no sources of strife and dissension, and that leads him into all these nasty things like eugenics and communism. Finally, we get to the third wave of argument, and that is: can we build this kind of state, and should we? Is it possible? Is it good? And here's what Plato has to say about this, which is kind of a clue to some of these debates about, well, does he really mean any of this? Here's what he says. So Socrates is saying, why did we set out on this whole discussion to begin with? It was for the sake of a pattern that we were seeking, both for what justice by itself is like and for the perfectly just man, if he should come into being, and in their turns for injustice in the most unjust man. He's saying we're looking for forms, right? The archetype, the ideal of the just and the unjust, both in the city and in the man. Thus, looking off at what their relationships to happiness and its opposite appear to be, we would also be compelled to agree in our own cases that the man who is most like them will have the portion most like theirs. We were not seeking them for the sake of proving that it's possible for these things to come into being. What you say is true, says Glaucon. Do you suppose a painter is any less good who draws a pattern of what the fairest human being would be like and renders everything in the picture adequately, but can't prove that it's also possible that such a man come into being? No, by Zeus, I don't, he said. And what about this? Weren't we, as we assert, also making a pattern in speech of a good city? So you see where this is going, right? That he's saying it's not our fault if it's impossible for the perfect city to come into being. And what we're really doing is we're just envisaging, we're picturing the perfect ideal so that we can learn what to strive for. So not in itself a bad thing. I've been suggesting, right, that the ideal is lacking some key elements, right? But again, I think that Plato knows that, because I think he's been tasked with a very specific project, or Socrates in the dialogue, right, has the very specific project of finding the most just city and the essence of justice. And this is, by the way, one of the reasons why the Bible says justice and peace shall kiss, right? That justice and mercy actually have an important, they're in some level irreconcilable in the here and now, but ultimately, right, will come in union in the perfect world, right? And it will not just be pure justice all the time. It won't just be cold rationality, but the heart will have a role to play as well. That's not what the Republic is about, right? The Republic is kind of just a searing look at justice in itself, and the harshness of it, and indeed some of the unsettling implications of cutting everything except justice out of your life. Next, we go on to say that the one thing that we actually, should want and can want is for philosophers to run the state. So he says, unless the philosophers rule as kings, or those now called kings and chiefs genuinely and adequately philosophize, and political power and philosophy coincide in the same place, while the many natures now making their way to either apart from the other are by necessity excluded, there is no rest from ills for the cities, my dear Glaucon, nor, I think, for humankind, nor will the regime we have now described in speech ever come forth from nature, insofar as possible, and see the light of the sun. That is what for so long was causing my hesitation to speak, seeing how very paradoxical it would be to say, for it is hard to see that in no other city would there be private or public happiness. And he said, Socrates, what a phrase and argument you have let burst out. Now that it's said, you can believe that very many men, and not ordinary ones, will on the spot throw off their clothes and, stripped for action, taking hold of whatever weapon falls into the hand of each, run full speed at you to do wonderful deeds. If you don't defend yourself with speech and get away, you'll really pay the penalty in scorn. So what's being said here essentially is, in order to create the perfect state, you have to create the perfect state, right? Because the one of the things that the perfect state would do is it would elevate those who are true philosophers. That is not just academics, but lovers of the good, the true, and the beautiful, right? And seekers after it, and after it in and of itself, right? Would elevate them to the top. But in order for the state to come about, you need those people at the top already. And so Plato is making this kind of enormous ask here, and we're getting a prelude of what we're going to get in a couple books, which is the crucifixion of the true philosopher, right? That if people really knew what you were about, that you want this, you would be pilloried, you would be taken to task, right, and destroyed. And so the rest of the book is sort of wrapped up in like an argument about basically what is philosophy in essence. And it turns out that it is this idea of knowledge of things in themselves, right? Let me read to you just a little bit of it to get a flavor. This will echo some of what we've talked about from the symposium. So he proceeds here by analogy to people who love certain kinds of things. For example, they love beautiful things, beautiful sights, right? He says, the one who is willing to taste every kind of learning with gusto, and who approaches learning with delight and is insatiable, we shall justly assert to be a philosopher, won't we? And Glaucon said, then you will have many strange ones, for all the lovers of sights are, in my opinion, what they are because they enjoy learning. And the lovers of hearing would be some of the strangest to include among philosophers, those who would never be willing to just go voluntarily to a discussion and such occupations, but who, just as though they had hired out their ears for hearing, run around to every chorus at the Dionysia, missing none in the cities or the villages. Will we say that all these men and other learners of such things and the petty arts are philosophers? Not at all, I said, but they are like philosophers. And the idea here is the same idea that we've covered, that in order to get at the truth of things, what you have to do is abstract away from the particular thing that you may love or be interested in, and get to what is called episteme, right? True knowledge. So in Greek, we have this distinction between episteme and doxa. And doxa is often translated as opinion, but it's basically just like your based on your perceptions, kind of what you think, without having a certain and sure grasp of the truth. And philosophy, it turns out, is going to be working your way up from the sort of beliefs that you have about the world into the pure realm of seeing things in themselves, the true, the good, and the beautiful. Maybe you've loved a beautiful person. Maybe you've seen other people that love beautiful people. And out of this, you gradually climb that ladder of diatomma to get to the pure, the true, the good. And this is, again, why Plato has this impulse to kind of scrape away or slough off all of the personal attachments that we have, because ultimately, right, in and through those personal attachments is coming something higher and purer. And real philosophy means ascending beyond the flesh, and seeing the good, the true, the beautiful in and of itself. Now, there's another part to this, which is that in other passages, Plato talks about bringing that knowledge back down into the here and now, right? Climbing the ladder back down, and not just being, like the perfectly enlightened man who achieves nirvana and never returns to earth, but rather like the man, like the bodhisattva, right? Who comes back down and sort of applies this knowledge and embodies it in time and space. And that's really kind of the antidote in some ways to some of the Platonic excesses that we've been talking about today. But what I really want you to take away from this foray into Book 5 is this idea, right, that if you really are going to be rationalist and nothing else, if you're going to cut out everything but your mind, you ultimately end up a monster, and you'll end up a very, very reasonable monster, right? Your brain is not going to save you. It's not going to like make you perfect, to abstract yourself into just what you can think your way through. And when people come to you and say, well, maybe you feel disgusted by the idea of living 24/7 in virtual reality, but that people felt disgusted by all sorts of things, right? This is, if you go and look up Matthew Ball, who is one of the foremost kind of metaverse theorists, he talks about these babies, right? Who you can look this up on YouTube. These babies who look at magazines, and they try to scroll through the magazines because they've only ever seen iPads, and so they think that you scroll through text. But of course, they're dealing with paper, so they're frustrated they can't find the next page, and they don't know that you flip a page in a magazine, right? And so he's saying, we're conditioned in certain ways by our upbringing to find certain things strange and certain things normal, and really all of our reactions are just like this. And up to a point, of course, this is perfectly true, right? There are some things, virtual reality is going to exist. There's going to be augmented reality. Some of it's going to do great stuff. It's going to help doctors to do surgery. It's going to help, it's going to build better movies, right? We're going to have all sorts of fun and beautiful and even excellent things that we can do with virtual reality. But if we abandon, right, in our approach to virtual reality, all our attachments to the fleshly here and now, then we will have put into our hands the most powerful tool imaginable to do the most awful things, right? This is why I keep harping on transhumanism. I keep harping on metaverse stuff. It's not because I think technology is inherently bad. It's not because I think we're going to stop any of this technology from coming into existence. It's because the people who are presenting it to us currently are asking us to jettison all of our current moral impulses and basically transcend into another kind of animal altogether, or something that's not an animal, but that's purely post-human, right? And that is a recipe for horrors untold, especially because it means that you're basically abandoning what makes you you, right? There's no such thing as you except in your body, except here living in the here and now. And abstracting yourself into just this pure mind, right, makes of you a horror like what we have been seeing in this book, like what we see all around us, right, in some of this, peak trans craziness, and the evidence for it is everywhere. And book five of the Republic is valuable for that, if nothing else, right? If only because it shows you what happens if you make an idol out of your reason, if you make an idol out of order and purity. Um, Next week, I'm going to talk a little bit more about this in the modern day. So that's it for book five of the Republic for now. And obviously, we'll keep going through all 10 books of it. But the next episode next week is going to be about sort of hyper rationalism in the modern day and the goods and the bads of this movement that to kind of strip away everything but reason and just look at things as in the most objective way possible. So that's coming up next week. So I took out a second mortgage on my house the other day so that I could have a steak, because that's what it takes now. Everything is so expensive, and they were in the biggest economic crisis since 2008. American Hartford Gold is here to help. The government is truly spending money and printing money like there is no tomorrow. It is a staggering figure, the money that they're spending. We're publishing an article about this in the Claremont Review of Books, just like how much money the government is spending. Really, this is not good stuff, and you need to protect yourself and your family from it so that you can be part of the Young Heretics empire, TM. Fabulously wealthy, fabulously intelligent, and fabulously jacked. That's the goal. And American Hartford Gold can help by showing you how to diversify a portion of your portfolio into physical gold and silver. I don't know if you noticed, but the government cannot print gold or silver, and they will even help you move your existing IRA or 401k out of the volatile stock market and into a precious metals IRA. They make it easy. And if you call right now, they will give you up to $1,500 of free silver on your first qualifying order. This is a really good deal, $1,500 worth of free silver when you text the word heretics, HERETICS, to 866-781-7499. Remember time, you got to text the word heretics to the number 866-781-7499. Don't wait. Okay, mailbag questions, as always, come to me on Locals. It's a fabulous community of VIPs who get the episodes of the show a week in advance, but they also get all sorts of other stuff. And they can help sort of support the show and keep it going, which is great. But I personally, I love the VIP community on Locals because we have such great discussions. We do a lot of talking about, how to apply the stuff we talk about in the show to our daily lives. I write sort of essays and reviews and articles that I post on there that you can only get on Locals. And you get to be in the mailbag and have all of your questions answered. So here is a mailbag question. If you want to join us, I hope you will. It's youngheretics.com/locals. Here's one from Elizabeth. If you could say one thing to the people who are not already interested in this kind of content, what would you want them to understand about studying great books? Okay, one thing only, and I really think this is important. When I talk to people who don't have a classical education or have never heard of Plato or whatever, one of the things that they almost always say to me is some variation of, I'm not that smart. I've heard those words themselves so many times. I'm not that smart. And I think that like what they mean by that is, you have all of this like education, you have this fancy degree, and I just feel like you are the kind of person who thinks about this stuff. I am not, right? I am a person that just kind of goes about his daily life. And I have my personal concerns and I have my projects and my interests, but I'm not really equipped to talk about this stuff. And therefore, it's not really relevant to me because how could it be? I can't access it. And they think that there's some kind of arcane knowledge that you need or some perfect idea that you need in order to get into these books. And of course, the grand irony is that the people who say I'm not that smart to me are always the most interesting people. Like that, when someone says that to me, I know the conversation is going to be really good because the next thing I ask is, "Oh, what do you mean by that?" Right? Like what? And they have these incredibly original reflections that are not bound by these kind of pieties that we now have in the academy, or these, or any, even indeed like these sort of political dogmas that we have. And yeah, like some of this stuff takes training, right? And that's kind of what I'm here for, is to offer like, the fruits of higher learning and to translate this stuff out of the foreign languages and all of that. But once it's presented to you in that way, and there's plenty of, plenty of good translations out there, plenty of people who are willing and ready to guide you. This stuff really is for you, and you are actually one of the best possible interpreters of it because you are living an actual human life, right? And if this stuff has any value at all, it's not because it furnishes material for PhD theses, right? It's because it has something to say to you about your soul, right? And you should always be thinking about those. Not every book is great for everybody. We've been talking on Locals about some books that are great, but we just don't like or whatever. But you're a person with like real, metaphysical things that you are facing, like high questions about how should I live my life. And there are books out there that are, offer you treasures of riches, right? For thinking through that. And if you're not getting that out of them, then maybe you're approaching people who are using them wrong, right? Maybe you've talked to people in the past who have used these books as ways of making them feel better than you, right? And there's so much of this out there. Like, I've read this, I've read that. And the sort of subtext of every lecture, every conversation is, well, you're really not good enough to get at this. But like, this stuff is for you, and you actually do have the capacity to access it and to think through it. It takes time, it takes effort and attention, right? The rewards are enormous, and you are equipped to do it because you're a human being with a brain, right? And because you are living a human life. So that would be my first thing is like, get over your sense that you're not that smart. Like put that out of your mind, and get over the idea that these things are designed to be impenetrable. They're not. They're designed to be for you. And there are people out there who are willing to help you get at them. That's it for now. There are other things that I would say, but I think we'll take that conversation off the pod and onto Locals. If you want to be part of that and all the other great stuff that's going on over there, go to youngheretics.com/locals to become a VIP and to learn all of the secrets. All right, folks, that's it for me this week. As always, if you like this show, you should check out the Claremont Institute where I work. It is a think tank for the recovery of the American idea, and a crucially important project, I believe, and you can help support us. You go to claremont.org/donate to help support our work, and you can also check out the Claremont Review of Books and The American Mind, both of which contain, I think, some of the best writing out there, and not just because I write for those publications as well, but also lots of other people have fascinating things to say on there. So check out the Claremont Institute, and I will see you next week for more truth, beauty, and the stuff that